Ladies and gentlemen, we're back today. We've got Stephen Duncombe. How you doing, Stephen?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Living and breathing. So you are a professor of media and culture at NYU, and you also have the Center of Artistic Activism. That's an interesting thing. What is that about?
I mean, this is the two sides of my life, right? It's like daytime, I'm a mild-mannered professor wearing a tie and a tweed jacket. And then, weekends roll around and breaks come, and I'm often flying off to sort of far reaches of the world and working with artists and activists all around the world, literally all around the world at this point. And kind of the way I like to explain it is we work with activists to make them create more like artists, and we work with artists to make them strategize more like activists. And at best, we put them together, and so they can combine the sort of, the effective strategies that activists know very well how to do with sort of that affective, touch, that affective reach that good artists know how to do.
Mm. And so your whole career has been built on the idea of combining the both to be more effective in what you do. So what are some examples of maybe stuff that you've worked on or ideas that you've had that you feel like would kind of up the ante on these average, just kind of picketing kind of protests? What can we do that's more exotic?
Sure. I mean, I should start out by saying that, I've been an activist since I was 17, and I organized some of the most boring protests known to humankind. And in fact, I was, one of the first sort of professional activist jobs I had was working for an outfit that would organize these huge marches on Washington. And we'd go down to Washington and, basically take this route on a Saturday when nobody is in Washington that had been pre-worked out with the police. We'd march, we'd chant usual 3-word chants to go start like something, just no, yes, no, won't go. And then we'd end up exactly where we began and then listen to speakers who we already knew what they were going to say, but we couldn't hear them because of bad sound systems. So I organized a lot of those, right? But then I started doing community organizing in the Lower East Side in the 1990s. And doing community organizing in the Lower East Side at that time meant you were organizing a lot of artists. And so we'd get together to do a demonstration about, say, rent control, or to plan a demonstration about community gardens. But when your community is made up of artists and DJs and performance artists, they bring definitely new ideas into what a demonstration is going to look like. They think about it as a performance. And one of the things I realized is that it worked better. More people wanted to come. We got more media. It was more joyful. It did what I think really good politics or art does, which is sort of disrupt the normal way we look at things and open up space to look at things in a brand new way. And so from that moment on, I like to think of them, I'm a very sort of mercenary art lover. Insofar as I love art because it makes for better politics. So that's how I came into this. A great example, I think, you've had the Yes Men on your show, and I work with the Yes Men a lot, and they do some really great stuff, which really kind of, their performances where they pretend to be someone who they're not, for example, is really great because, if you're an activist, you stand up on a soapbox and you say, you should be believing this and denouncing that. Essentially, people know who you are and they either agree with you or they disagree with you, but you've already been put in a box. What I love about the Yes Men and other really good artistic activists is it's a politics which doesn't look like politics. They present themselves as corporate heads, but they're not corporate heads. And it creates this sort of space of questioning, which opens people up to rethink those patterns of politics, which they'd normally think, make sense of the world through.
Yeah. And they do it masterfully. And it is the suspension of disbelief before people find out that this is not the guy from the place. And it really, by then, it's sort of sunk in your brain that this company could be so egregious or whatever.
Exactly.
Did your activities in the Lower East Side in the 90s, did they overlap with the C-Squat people in those days?
Yes, definitely. And in fact, I lived on 13th Street between B and C, which was kind of everything on the other side of the street. I lived in actually paid rent, I think by today's standards, like $250, right? But I was the sucker paying money. All the big squats were on the other side. And I was there when they all got raided and all got shut down. And that sort of moment in Lower East Side history pretty much ended because either the squats ended up figuring out how to buy their buildings, or people just got displaced massively.
Yeah. And did they do well acquiring the property? A few people got a few buildings?
A few people the people that were better organized got buildings and live in them now.
Good for them.
Including ABC No Rio, which was the sort of squat that was also the great art space and punk rock space.
I got to see the World Friendship Inferno Society, whatever it's called. I saw them in New Orleans, like their reunion show, because I was too young for that generation. But still, when I saw them and I learned the whole, made some old timey friends from that time. Very impressive. I'm glad that we have that kind of activism in modern day.
Yeah.
So what you've been writing books for a long time. You've written quite a few. You have one called The Art of Activism, Your All-Purpose Guide, which came out not too long ago. You co-wrote with somebody.
Yep.
It's kind of a manual of sorts.
Yeah, for making the impossible possible. I wrote it with Steve Lambert, who I co-founded the Center for Artistic Activism with.
Ah, okay, good to know. I did research, but not enough. Also, you have a new book that I want to talk about, The Activist Angler, which, for everybody that doesn't know, that's fishing. It draws parallels between fishing and political activism. How did you come up with this idea?
It's one of my stranger books, and admittedly probably has a small demographic that is interested in it. But hopefully I'm going to widen the demographic through your show, because it is about fishing and it is about activism. But it's also sort of like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is about motorcycles and is about Zen, but it's really actually about reflecting on, in that case, what it is to be human, or in my case, what it is to be an activist and how to be an activist and how to be an activist for a long period of time. I'm now 57. I became an activist when I was 17 years old. Okay, so that's 40 years of being an activist, and I plan on being an activist until the day I die. So where did this book come from? It came out of, historical circumstances. Take Marx out of the boy, but you can't take the boy out of Marx, or vice versa, which is the material conditions were COVID. And I was in a situation in which I needed something to do where I didn't need to wear a mask, where I wasn't around people, and where I could forget about the political apocalypse that seemed to be happening all around us in that unmanaged first few months of COVID, where we had a bumbling, president not running things. And so at that time, I was out on the tip of Cape Cod, and I remembered that when I was young, I was a big fan of fishing. And I loved to go fishing. And then I gave it up when I was about 13 or 14 because sex and punk rock and skateboards were a lot more interesting. And then I didn't do it for, now 45 years or so. And I went back to it. Cape Cod has some of the best fishing, obviously the saltwater fishing, but also freshwater fishing as well. And I went back to it, and I had to reteach myself how to fish. And so every snarled line, every sort of, fish caught or fish lost more often, or fish not caught at all most of the time, seemed to have a lesson for me. It's like beginner's mind, right? As you go into it and everything is new and everything has a lesson for you. But at the same time, I was consulting with activist groups around the world. And one series of campaigns we were working on was around anti-corruption activism in the Western Balkans and in West Africa. And as I'd be on the phone to these folks in Bosnia who are planning an action, and they're saying, well, where should we have this action? And I'd be like, well, what are your options? They said, well, there's traditionally like a speaker's corner where everybody does their activism. I said, okay, well, that's good. But, I found that it's best to fish where the fish are and not where the fish aren't. And they'd be like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, for the first couple of months fishing, I was fishing where there weren't any fish. At times when there weren't any fish, and I wasn't catching any fish. And then I realized, there's certain places and certain times where fish show up, and then you catch a lot of fish. And they're like, okay, and I'm like, where do people go on a Saturday? And they're like, they go to the market. And I'm like, you got to go to the market. That's where you're going to have your action. And then they're like, well, what kind of action should we do? And I'm like, well, I found that, you really got to study the shoreline in order to figure out what kind of lure you want to use. And they'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? And I'm like, look, you can't go into a freshwater stream and use a saltwater plug. You can't go into a market and disrupt it with a big demonstration that won't let people shop. You've got to figure out how to actually interface with where people are and what they're doing. And so they came up with this brilliant idea of creating a shopping stall. But instead of selling stuff, what they would do is they would talk about their issues, and they would stage sort of corrupt actions and try to get people to buy them off. And they created this brilliant sort of, intervention that worked really well in a market and attracted lots of people, all because of fishing.
I love this. I love this idea because you need to get under the skin. You need to create some kind of value for people to absorb something into their hearts and minds. And you can't do the force feeding. It's probably the worst that you could do. It seems counterintuitive. Are there specific groups that are fighting for different rights, like trans rights, animal rights? Which group has kind of the most impressive kind of approach?
Sex workers.
Get out of here, really?
Yeah. We do a lot of work organizing sex workers, and it just has to do with one of those strange things about funding. And so we work with sex workers unions in South Africa. We work with the European sex workers unions, and as one of them said during one of our trainings, well, what do? We perform for people's desire. Isn't that what activism is about? In other words, they have a very good sense of how to please people, how to attract people, how to fake an orgasm if necessary, right? And in a way, that's what activism is about, right? Which is about performing for people and getting people to feel that they matter and feel that they are worthy in the world, even if it has to be somewhat of a performance. And so they were great to work with. We staged some incredible actions both in Cape Town in South Africa and Johannesburg in South Africa, and also in Dublin, Ireland. The one in Dublin, I'll just tell you about, was really great. They had just passed a law saying that any two sex workers who work together were engaged in a conspiracy, and that would be illegal. Even though sex work is not illegal, the conspiracy of working in concert would be therefore a conspiracy. So what we did is we set up a huge massage where we did hand massages to people, right? And then as people came and got their free hand massages, we would start saying, do you know you're engaged in a criminal conspiracy? And then we would start talking to people. And then we had a sexy Santa, because it was Christmas, come up and arrest the people who had who were engaged in the conspiracy. And then they'd have the mug shots taken. They were great. It was so much fun.
Yeah. I mean, and sex workers, God bless them. The last people that really own their own, business, the last small business person. Yeah, that's the funniest thing I've heard all week. So you get to travel a lot. Where else do you go? I mean, you went. Does this happen all the time? Do people call on you and say, "Hey, come help us plan an event"?
Yeah. It's essentially we work either through funding organizations like Open Society or activist groups like Greenpeace will call us and say, "Hey, we'd like to for example, work with our East Asian actions team." And we'll go and work with them. The strangest place we've probably ever been was Scotland, not because Scotland is strange, but we worked on the first Scottish independence ballot, and I couldn't understand a word that those people said. And, we go all around the world, right? And so I'm used to really thick accents or having translators, but, the Scots, bless them, love them, hope they get their independence, but boy, I cannot understand what they said. But that has ramped down for me. And this goes back to the fishing, okay, which is, I pretty much every other week was in the back of a plane traveling someplace, and we don't travel first class. We don't travel business class. We travel like in the back of a plane surrounded by screaming babies. That's the class that we travel in. And it was getting pretty trying on me and getting trying on my family. And then COVID hit and it shut everything down. So, part of that was this retreat back to a moment where I started to think about, well, what does it mean for me to continue as an activist for the rest of my life? Because I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. Just like when I was in my 20s and 30s, I had to stop being a street activist, getting out on the street, demonstrations, so on and so forth, because I needed to stop and start to raise a family. And here I was, jetting around the world, doing very exciting things, but also sort of missing my family. And I realized something, which is, if you're going to be an activist for a long period of time, then you have to take on the identity of an activist who's going to be doing it for a long time, which means you have to find ways to be human. And probably the most profound lesson I learned fishing, and learn every time I go fishing, is most of the time you don't catch fish. Most of the time you're just there. And you have to learn how to love the process and slow yourself down into the process if you're going to remain fishing for any length of time. If you're just about the thrills that come with an action, or the thrills that happen because you're going off to West Africa to do an action with these incredible artist folks, you're going to quit. If you just are in it for the wins, if you're just in it to catch the fish, you're going to quit, because the wins come very rarely in fishing. The wins come very rarely in activism. You don't catch that many fish, you don't win that many campaigns. But if in order to catch fish or win campaigns, you have to do it over and over and over again, every single day. And so to do that, you have to figure out, how is it going to balance with the rest of your life? My dad was an activist. He had started out being an activist around anti-apartheid in 1948. Just imagine that. Worked in the civil rights movement, became an anti-war activist, and was active all the way into his 80s. I went to his funeral, spoke at his funeral, and speaker after speaker came up and talked about his unceasing activism and his tireless activism and what an example he was. But I knew the real secret, which is he quit all the time. He just came back. He would take breaks. He would, take breaks for years at a time, but he'd always come back to activism because he figured out a way that it could actually be part of his life. And so fishing, I learned patience. I learned persistence. And that's really what it takes to be an activist for the long run.
You manage the same thing that your father did, find a balance. Do you take a vacation from everything related to the problems in the world and just kind of...
Well, that's what fishing is.
Right.
I mean, that was the break, both from the world, but also from being an activist and being engaged in the world. It just so happened that in taking that break, I learned that fishing has a whole bunch of things to say about activism. Irony of ironies.
Yeah. And I'm sure the fish is glad if you're so zenned out by the time you catch him, that you just feel at one with the universe and you just let him go again.
Oh yeah. I mean, when I fish in New York City, and by the way, there are fish in New York City. There are huge primeval carp in Washington, in
walking around Greenwich Village.
not walking around Greenwich, but not that far away in Central Park. And then I fish for rockfish off Christopher Street Pier in Greenwich Village. But there are lots of fish there, and you have to let them go in New York. But even in Cape Cod, I let most of them go because, one, how many fish am I going to eat? Two, some of the best freshwater fishing is bass fishing, and they taste like mud. But one of the things I realized also about fishing is no matter how humane you try to be, you're going to kill some fish.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that wouldn't happen, that I've gotten really good at getting the hooks out of their mouths. I take the barb off the hooks, but invariably they swallow a hook and I have to kill a fish. Or I catch a nice striper and I want to kill it because I want to eat it. And they bleed.
Yeah.
And
hey, I'm vegan, man. So
yeah, and I'm not. But what's valuable about that, and what I learned about that for activism, is sometimes your activism hurts people. Sometimes those people deserve to be hurt. We did campaigns against landlords in Lower East Side. They were jerks. They were exploiting people. We succeeded in putting one out of business, and his employees all went out of business too. And that's, you kind of have to carry that with you. Sometimes in order to, be a good activist, people are going to get hurt. That's just part of the process.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the way things work. And again, fishing, you're going to kill some fish. Activism, you're going to hurt some people, but you have to take responsibility for that. You can't just look the other way. You have to know that that's going to happen.
Right. I mean, life is not all, pillows and rainbows. Sometimes it's life or death, and collateral damage is going to happen when especially in activism. I mean, so historically, you've probably studied this a lot, and I know that there's some stuff on your website about historical forms of activism and stuff. People like Bill Ayers or Weatherman Underground. What can you name some others in history that ran the spectrum?
Yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, probably, I think some of the most effective artistic activists really came out of the civil rights movement, the U.S. civil rights movement in the 50s and the 1960s, because they really, really knew how to stage demonstrations and protests in order to make the invisible visible. The violence of white supremacy was something which a lot of the country wanted to look the other way. It's stuff that happened in the black parts of towns, or it happened after the sun went down, when there were no news reporters around or cameras. And the brilliance of the civil rights movement, from Rosa Parks on through sort of the campaign to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, about 8 years later, was that they would stage these moments in which to highlight the injustices of white supremacy in such a way that it could be photographed, it could be reported upon, and then reported around the world, and would embarrass the federal government. So they would put pressure on the state government, and finally embarrass the federal government enough so they passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But I would argue that all good activism is artistic activism. When we do our trainings, we do a long stretch of history, and depending on where we're working in the world, we start that history with either Moses, Jesus, or the Prophet Muhammad, because all of them engaged in story, in spectacle, in using signs and symbols as a way to both critique the world in which they were living, but also put forth a vision of a new world. And that's what arts does really well when paired with activism, is that sort of changing of a perspective. So you see the world, it used to be normal, and all of a sudden you see it in a different way. Or the big what if question, right? Which is, what if the world was operated differently? It could look like this.
Yeah. Some dystopian hellhole nightmare. What if?
Well, dystopian hellhole, nightmare for sure. And often, artistic activists use dystopia, but I think dystopia in some ways is a dead end, because it doesn't allow us a vision of what could be in the future. That it is really good at critiquing the present, but sometimes it leaves us stuck in that present. And it's necessary, right? Because we've got to say, no, stop. Right. But we also need to know yes, this is what we're for. And I always think of, what is it? Speaking of Jesus, in the kingdom of heaven, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. I mean, that is like this mind-blowing vision of everything that wasn't true about his society, but imagining a society to be where you would have that justice.
We would call him a communist now for that.
We would definitely call, and he was a communist, let's face it.
Yeah, let's face it. And that makes the whole thing more appealing than the economic system we currently have.
Yes.
So, but I've heard you talk before about things being too visceral, or somebody coming from a position of being just angry, and how useless that really is. So you're saying you have to give an option. Don't just show the horrible part. Give us a back door.
Yeah, I think so very much. I really think that, there's this kind of myth that we don't know what's wrong with society. And so I'm going to tell you what's wrong with society. I think we all know what's wrong with society. The problem is we can't imagine anything better. Margaret Thatcher, the conservative prime minister of Great Britain, had this saying, there is no alternative. And that was her line. Get used to it. This is the best things are going to be. There is no alternative to like harsh shock therapy capitalism. And I think, art is all about alternatives, and it's all about imagining a different way to be. And I think you don't just keep people down by, pushing their face in the dirt. You keep them down by not letting them look up. And I think art's at its best creates those visions of what we can look up to.
Wow. Now, you just said a mouthful there. The instituted kind of hopelessness that they make sure that your spirit is broken. Don't try. Stay unimaginative. And you feel like this kind of sociopathic mathematical people have taken over and stifled creativity. It's like they don't teach us creativity in school as much as they should, right?
Or they teach you technical skills. A great example of this sort of learning how to look up. Or we were working in Macedonia, now North Macedonia. At that time, it was called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, because the Greeks, of course, complained that they couldn't call themselves Macedonia. So they were called the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. So we were there, and we were working with LGBTQ groups. And it was a really bad place to be queer. There was a right-wing nationalist government and lots of repression, while that same government was spending immense amounts of money on all of these ugly statues, these nationalist statues, and all this sort of, it's as if Donald Trump was able to build a capital of an entire country. That's what downtown Skopje looks like. Okay. So we started working with them, and at the end of our trainings, after 4 days, we always, within 24 hours, we plan, execute, stage, and then reflect upon an action. Right? Only happened in 24 hours. And when we first started doing it, people were like, "Well, we are really pissed off because we have been marginalized, and if they're going to say, basically, fuck you to us, we're going to say fuck you back to them." And we're like, okay, that's really satisfying. Totally understand why you're angry. It really sucks to be queer. The headquarters had just been broken into, and so on and so forth. I said, but, the problem with that is they're saying you don't belong. And in a way, what you're doing is putting yourselves outside of Macedonian society by saying, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. You are Macedonian society. And they're like, yeah, we are. But we're not the Macedonian society we want to live in. And then we're like, so let's build that society. And so in 24 hours, we staged something we called the Future Republic of the Former Republic of Macedonia. And we took over a part of a park, and we created a frontier with a border guard. We created new passports. We had a podium where people could stand up, and instead of being these horrible, statues, they could proclaim themselves everyday heroes and heroines of the new Macedonia. We, as people came through the gate, we would clap, and they could talk to. We had big banners up. Talk to your fellow queer Macedonian. Talk to your fellow Roma Macedonians. Working with Roma rights folks as well. And it was the most successful demonstration they had in 10 years. One, nobody got beat up, but more than that, kids came, grandparents came, schools came. I don't know if they quite knew what they were coming to, right? Sort of queer utopia, but it was an amazing, amazing thing. And what's so cool is within about 3 or 4 years, two things happened. The right-wing government was brought down, and they had their first Pride parade in Macedonia. And so there was no direct correlation between the two, but it was, this moment of opening up to see what's above, as opposed to just getting fixated on who's keeping you on the ground.
Right. And we're still going to battle with these kind of regimes all over the world. They ebb and they flow and they come back. And Uganda just voted some law in recently. What was that about? Do you know?
Yeah, well, Uganda is a very particular and peculiar history as homophobia. But they just increased the sentences which were already there for criminalizing homosexuality.
Talk about going back in time.
Yep.
Well, America's on its way backwards too. Everybody's pedaling backwards these days. So is there any other books that you want to talk about before we go? Because you've written so many, I kind of want to know about a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, kind of moving backwards. Yeah, The Activist Angler is my latest. Before that is The Art of Activism, which was really trying to take all of these lessons we had learned in workshops at the Center for Artistic Activism and putting them into a book form, which is amazingly illustrated by Steve Lambert. Before that was a book that really kind of turned my thinking, and it came out of my experience in the Lower East Side. It's called Dream, Imagining Politics in an Age of Fantasy, which was really an embrace of fantasy. Unfortunately, that was like 12 years ago. The wrong side of the political spectrum seemed to really embrace it, the right, not the left. But still, I still think that the retreat is not back into sort of sober rationality, but instead into sort of better dreams, and dreams that are quite honest about being dreams. My next book, which will be coming out in about 6 months, is called Affect, assessing the affect and effect of arts and activism. And it really gets at, kind of draws on who I am and what I'm trained as a social scientist. It's trying to figure out, how do you know if this stuff actually works? And how do you actually measure it in a way that's appropriate to the practice? And so in that book, I get kind of wonky and create a methodology of assessment that actually I think works with artistic activism.
So what are the metrics?
The metrics are, you ask people what they're trying to do, and then you ask them what would be the best way to measure this. I know this sounds simplistic, but the problem with most assessment is it goes in and says, here are the metrics I'm going to measure.
Right.
But they're not necessarily what the artistic activist or the community group is interested in measuring. So instead of going in with prescriptions, we go in with questions. What sort of artistic aim do you have? In other words, what sort of affect do you want to create? What sort of political goals do you have? What sort of effect do you want to create? Who is your audience? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to feel? What do you want them to do? What are your concrete objectives that you want to have happen? And then we get around to, well, how do we know if this actually happened? And opening it up like that allows for a really kind of interesting way of thinking about metrics, sometimes which get built into the actions themselves. And so we've done actions where we're actually measuring sort of public participation in the action itself. So from that perspective, it's really neat. But I'll let you in, and I know we're closing down on time, your listeners, on the most important secret of assessing things like artistic activism is we will never know actually if it works or not. But because there's just too many variables, and what artistic activism works best at is like blowing people's minds and changing their consciousness and so on and so forth. And that's just really hard to measure, okay? Even though we did some of it in this experiment in Copenhagen. But getting artistic activists or any activist or any artist to think really carefully about what they want to have happen, for whom, and how they would actually know if things changed, ends up making for more impactful work. Because it focuses people and it really gets them thinking, not like, I'm mad, I'm going to stage a demonstration. I'm mad, I'm going to make a poster. But instead saying, I'm mad, what kind of change do I want to create? And how can I use my creativity in order to make that change happen?
I'm certainly mad, but I'm getting too old to be that mad all the time.
Go fishing.
And I think that the best human beings are the ones that plant trees for the shade that they'll never get to experience, right? Mm-hmm. And I love this idea. So, well, thanks for coming. You come back, you do it again. And if anybody out there who's struggling with and has a movement, needs help, give a ring to Stephen Duncombe. Also, go pick up his book, The Activist Angler. It's out now. Quite wonderful human being. Is there anything you want to add before we go?
No, just thank you so much for having me on your show.
All right. Well, we'll sign off to the people in TV land, and we'll chat briefly after. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care.